Thank you very much, Tim. Firstly, prosaic matters. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. If you can't, just move. If you don't want to, just move further back. Tim talked about telling a story, and this book does try to tell a story. It is a global story, a story that begins almost with the beginning of humanity, and which embodies many of the most remarkable things that humanity has done. And it's not a story that's over, and I'm not sure that it's a story that's ever quite been told before. It's a story of sacred space, and in particular of that dimension of sacred space which is perhaps easiest to get a grip on and which knocks you sideways most often: sacred architecture. But by sacred, I mean that which is of the profoundest significance, that which tries to approach whatever the word the divine means to you at all times and in all cultures. So you won't be surprised to hear that I nearly ended up in hospital trying to write it. And that's why the talk I want to give now is going to be firstly relatively brief, because I'm bearing in mind the presence of people whose attention spans can vary, and a little bit personal, because this book starts ultimately, and indeed my life's work starts ultimately, with a single experience that I can date quite closely to the autumn of 1972 or 3, my parents will correct me on which, when I was driven along a lane in Devon, and we rounded the corner, and I saw that. Now this is the church of St Michael de la Roupe, St Michael of the Rock, and as you can see, it is well named. And I don't know exactly what it is that did that, whatever it is, to me when I first saw this place, but it was clearly partly about something that human beings have done, something very visible, that little building on top of that hill there. But it was equally about the place itself, some kind of interaction between what is basically an extinct volcano and a tiny but very striking place of worship. And it was as if somebody had taken a key sort of into the depths of my soul and turned the key in the lock. And basically I've been trying to work out what's on the other side of the door ever since. I'm trying to understand how that lock works ever since. There is another experience which I can also date quite closely. It wasn't quite such an earth-shattering experience, but in a way it's where the gestation of this particular book begins. I know that this was in January or February 1985, and more to the point, I had my Kodak Instamatic in my pocket, and so I have a photograph to record it. I can remember thinking, I only have 36 pictures on this roll, and they're expensive, but this is a moment that's going to deserve one of them. I was in Qinghai province in western China, and I was in a Tibetan Buddhist monastery, and I went for a little walk. And at the top of a hill, a low, grassy hill, there was a grove of trees, and the grove of trees had been wrapped up in rows of flags. And the words that are printed on those flags are prayers. The colours of those flags are symbolic, so there was meaning and there was colour. And you couldn't really say there was architecture, and yet there was the same powerful something, which was to do with something designed that human beings had done to something natural that had already been there, wrapping up a grove of trees in prayer flags, which was just as powerful, just as striking as these ancient medieval parish churches in the Western Europe that I already knew so well. And this just said to me, sacred space, human responses to sacred space are astonishingly varied. And as somebody who just stepped out of the boat for the first time, how many other ways are there of doing this? This is not a building. This is a wrapped-up coppice. And yet somehow an environment has been created, and something happens to one's emotions in that environment. It's the same thing. There's a little altar there on which yak butter is burnt. And so there were smells, as well as the sounds of the flapping, and the meanings encoded in the flags themselves, and the very numinous sense of place. So this global investigation really starts, in my mind, with that moment. And I just want to talk in a little bit more detail about how remarkable some of the resulting similarities can be. Because although there's a great contrast between these two things, one thing that both of them does is to create an enclosure. A bit of the landscape has been set apart by designed human intentional activity. And I think this act of enclosure, which doesn't necessarily, as you can see here, create a shelter, is crucial globally to these ideas about creating sacred spaces. And perhaps they're most deeply embodied by the idea of a sanctuary. Here is a sanctuary. And there is a hierarchy of sacredness, if you like, which starts with the mundane world outside and ratchets up as you approach the sanctuaries of planet Earth. So you can see that in this very primitive, simple parish church. It's a long, thin thing. It's along an axis. This is along an axis. And at the end of that axis, here is the sanctuary, which is the raison d'etre of the building. It enables a large group of people to stand in a space and focus on acts that take place at one end of that space within the sanctuary, where a smaller number of people may stand. Apart from that axial space, there are only two elements to this building. Something that makes it unmissable. An attempt at a tall structure and a very emphatic entranceway. Compare and contrast a building created about 50 years before this one, but about 3,000 miles away. The Devi Jagdamba Temple in Khajuraho in India. Very tall thing, axis, emphatic entranceway. This is a lavishly articulated structure, and you can see here that these ideas of creating lavishly ornamented, rippling interiors are very common in sacred spaces. But a Martian touring the architecture of the planet in the mid-12th century might have been forgiven for thinking that sorry, I've got a clever thing here. That is a sort of simplified version of that created by somebody so far away that they haven't quite got the idea right. When in fact, they're profoundly separate. They have no knowledge of each other whatsoever. There are, of course, important differences. This tower contains bells, as you, I'm sure, all know. In this building, the sanctuary is under the tower. Whereas in this building, the sanctuary is at the other end from the tower. And this is a symbolic tower. It invokes all kinds of ideas that are crucial in humanism about the nature of the cosmos and about mountains. Well, I've already said much more than I thought I was going to say. But I just want to get one thing across that's rather important in an age of doubt, and that is to get across how significant the story of religious buildings is to humanity. Let's just park for a moment whether we're interested in spirituality or what the word divine might mean or why people have religions. And remember, just looking for, the biggest, the tallest things on the planet until the 19th century were the Pyramid of Cheops of Giza, 3rd millennium BC. The cathedral spires of medieval Europe, possibly the highest thing in the world was the spire on top of Lincoln Cathedral. And perhaps a couple of stupas in Sri Lanka. We don't exactly know how high they were. The first structure that human beings created that out-topped those buildings in height was the Washington Monument in the mid-19th century. So just if you're looking for these kind of rude indicators of human achievement, it's clear that religion has been in the driving seat until comparatively recently, and I think it's true to say that in most cultures, at most times, the most important architecture is religious. That architecture actually starts with religion. The first buildings we know about that are more than homes, that are trying to do something clearly aesthetic, are burial places and temples in the 10th millennium BC. And with a couple of exceptions, perhaps ancient China is one, perhaps ancient Rome is another, almost, the crucial buildings and the story of architecture created by human beings is a story of religion. And one can only understand these buildings by understanding the different cultural traditions which created them. The big change, of course, comes with the thing we call modernity. And it's very interesting that the first thing to replace the pyramids of Giza and the cathedral spires as the tallest thing on the planet is not an office block or a railway station, but one of the many ways in which ideas about special sacred places have translated themselves into a post-faith world. Cenotaphs, memorials, millennium domes, and this is an early example, I think, of this very modern kind of sacred place. What were the largest buildings in the world? The Great Temple of Karnak, the Great Mosque at Cordoba, the Benedictine Abbey at Cluny, Angkor Wat, Cambodia, certainly before the 16th, 17th century. Are those all of them? Let's argue about it otherwise. They are all religious buildings. Taking the biggest and the highest is a bit of a kind of boys' parlour game, but I hope it makes the point about the significance of these buildings regardless of faith, let alone the ways in which faith is the way in which human beings asked profound questions about the nature of the universe, which became what we call science, but which for millennia came from within the faith traditions of the world and were inseparable from them. It's been a fascinating journey putting this book together, and during it I started to see if there were kind of E equals MC squared type, generalizations that one could play with that sum the whole story up. Now, there are various of these, but here's one of my current favourites. Here are the two longest standing and still existing types of religious building: the synagogue and the stupa. Rather enjoyably, they both emerge at about the same time, about the 3rd century BCE. One of them is actually a latecomer in this grand story of axial buildings with a sanctuary at one end. But it's also a significant latecomer because this is probably the first religious building type which is designed specifically so that congregation can take place. It's essential to Judaism that all of the faithful gather. Before this there had been axial buildings, but congregation wasn't an essential part of them. And so mosques and churches are descended from these. And this is about interiors, it's about architecture, it's about events with one focus at one end, as other axial structures before it had been. The other is a building without an interior. A building that you can walk around. A building in which a kind of pilgrimage is staged. And it's a reminder that movements through landscapes and towards buildings, as with the Kaaba at Mecca, as with the pilgrims who left Bristol for Jerusalem and Santiago in the Middle Ages, is a crucial part of sacred space. And it's a structure whose very form is symbolic, is imbued with ideas. It's there simply to symbolise things. And this is another crucial idea in sacred space. And finally, it's centralised, it's circular. And the story of sacred architecture everywhere is, I think, about a millennia-old debate between standing in the middle of an extraordinary space and standing at one end of an extraordinary space. Well, I could carry on for a long time like this, convincing myself that I'm being fascinated. But perhaps we'd better come back to where we are now, and perhaps back to the personal as well. Because perhaps the most notable thing about the structure that you're in right now is that it's another one of these attempts at a very tall building. In this case, as Tim said, designed really, I think, to show off to one of the most important harbours in northwest Europe. Also located within a minute's walk of the site of the former medieval synagogue of medieval Bristol, which of course has long disappeared. And an extraordinary statement, which is a reminder that these buildings don't have a function in the sense that a home or an office or a toilet or a school has a function in terms of the things that human beings have to do to stay alive: shelter, work, prepare food. You don't need any of this. I'll come back to that in a moment. Let's just stay with this very tall building for a while, because it happens to date from the mid-15th century, and the mid-15th century is just at the dawn of what struck me was the great age of the dome. Within a couple of decades of this, Hagia Sophia, one of the great churches of the world, had become a mosque. Constantinople had fallen to the forces of the Ottoman Empire. That's one of the great domes in the world. And a few years later, the Sultani Mosque in Istanbul was built, biggest dome in Islamic architecture. The Shah Mosque in Isfahan was built. Brunelleschi's dome in Florence is just being completed as that goes up. St Paul's Cathedral comes a couple of hundred years later. St Peter's Rome comes between them. And if you carry on going east, the Taj is being finished. Incidentally, the Taj Mahal was finished within 30 years of the creation of the first Anglican place of worship in India. There's an unexpected thought. And so we have this 200-year period when suddenly everybody everywhere seems to be doing domes. And I don't think anybody's connected this up before. So you pass this wonderful tower, and you go through one of these very emphatic, richly textured entranceways, which are so important to sacred space, a threshold to the sanctuary, if you like. And you come inside, and it's an axis, and these axial places of worship go back through the synagogue into ancient Mesopotamia. They have their origins perhaps in the 5th millennium BC, but it's an axis with aisles either side. And this basilican plan is part of a very interesting phenomenon in our global story, which is when people actually sit down and think, we've got a new faith, how are we going to create buildings for it? That's what Constantine the Great architects seemed to do for Christianity in about 310 AD. And it's also what's the... I've forgotten their names. Islam did in Damascus and Jerusalem in the 670s and 680s. And when Constantine the Great's architects borrowed the basilica for the church, they set up an idea which we're sitting in now and which we're still creating in churches across the world. So it's a very successful idea. But I mentioned just now about the significance of these buildings and about their lack of a mundane, practical function in terms of just, being mammals that exist on planet Earth and live and eat and die. This is remarkable in several respects. It's a testimony to the significance of the cultural dimension of of being human. And beyond that, to the significance of the spiritual dimension of being human. To the fact that art matters, making art is part of what makes us human. That all these things in all these cultures exist in spite of not needing to exist in the way that a rabbit needs a burrow, is fundamentally and essentially human. But there is one thing that these buildings do, which human beings have to do, because we all die. And when we die, we need to go somewhere, preferably underground, pretty rapidly, or life gets a bit smelly and other people start to die. And I think all of these buildings, all these faiths, are partly, among a huge panoply of other things, connected with man's response to this oblivion, which we all have to live with and face. And here we have Edward Blanket, probably named after the thing he bought and sold. Don't laugh, George Snigger. People have been doing that joke in here for 400 years. In fact, the Christian willingness to put monumentalised tombs inside places of worship is one of the things that marks churches out as different from the buildings of other faiths. But nevertheless, all faiths have found ways of dealing with burial, which are something that human beings just have to do, and which always relate to the religious ideas of that tradition and always include ideas about sacred space. Perhaps, certainly the oldest things we can call architecture in our language, in our landscape in England, are the long barrows of Wiltshire, and those stupas from which domes may be ultimately derived go back to what happens, what kind of sacred space you create when you mound earth over a body and then decide to shape it. And I wanted to end this talk with that thought, because I want to end the talk with some acknowledgements, and the most significant acknowledgement is to my wife and my family. And as many of you know, my wife can't be here today because at the other extreme of the Eurasian landmass, her mother's funeral took place this afternoon. And it's to an encounter with her world and her culture that I owe much in this book, and it's her willingness to take stuff on while Dad writes a history of world religious architecture in a year that I owe very much. So the first person I have to thank, even though she's not here, is her and my family who can be here, and my absent family who we miss. But beyond that, all of our families, all of you for coming today, which is really lovely. The people who worked almost as hard on this book as I did, including Chris Westall, the editor, Susanna Stone and Julia Brown, the picture researchers, and Emma Copestake, Alan Somerville, the designer, Janice Mitchell and Duncan Baird. Janice came on one of my tours and put me together with Duncan Baird, took me out for a snifter in the Grouch show, some kind of thing I do all the time. And it's thanks to that conversation that this book was able to happen. And all of those who worked for Duncan Baird Publishing. And a whole realm of people who helped out in the course of it. Hazim Abbas helped with translations from Persian and Arabic. The very Reverend David Hoyle, Dean here at Bristol, read through the Christian chapter, and Sharman Kaddish did so with the Jewish chapter. Lydia Morey, who I'm delighted to see is in the audience somewhere, I can't see her at this moment, did sterling work trying to find a way of communicating with the great Shinto shrine of Usei, which is one of the most moving new discoveries for me in the story of global sacred space that came out of this book. And finally to Tim and Richard and everybody here at St Stephen's for making available this wonderful local testimony to a global phenomenon which is of such profound significance that it's actually impossible to articulate, so I'm not quite sure why I've bothered, except that I'd love you to come down here pick up something more to drink, more to eat, and if you want to buy a book or even more than a book or have it signed, please do. Thank you for coming.